Let's get started. All right. So, welcome everybody. Today, I'm really pleased to have Julian Fletcher, and we're going to do something different. We're going to talk about architecture, we're going to talk about writing a book, and we're going to talk about what the future looks like. So, welcome, Julian. It's wonderful to have you join me.
Thank you kindly, Deirdre. Hello, everybody out there. Hope everybody's well. Hope the weather's well. It's mild over here in Kent, England. I've just been told it's very hot by somebody who's far more informed than me, but it's pleasant anyway.
Good. I can't say the same in New Zealand. We are deeply in winter, and it's not quite as pleasant as on your side. It's not bad though. Apparently the Brits still come to New Zealand for the weather. So I suppose it's a good thing. Yeah.
For a bit, a while ago, I think it was because of the Lord of the Rings, to be honest, and see the scenery. I have never done that yet, but that's mainly what I know. A bit about rugby and the Lord of the Rings in terms of New Zealand, which is a very limited subset. I appreciate.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about you, Julian. Let's first start with giving people a little bit of a background. So, can you take us through your personal journey into business architecture? Obviously, we all come from different backgrounds. And what are your key experiences or challenges? Because you've obviously written a book, but maybe if you can just give a little bit of a background into you and your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I graduated back in the mid 90s, seems a long time ago, in electronic engineering. Like so many people of engineering degrees, I ended up as a computer coder at the time. That's where a lot of the jobs were, as opposed to, say, the more technical aspects of engineering as such. Did that for about 10 years. Towards the end of that, I got interested in online learning, e-learning, online training, and just happened to coincide with a delayering of my then organization. So I got paid effectively a year's salary in advance. Decided to go back to university, did a 1 year MSc in that learning technology area, which led to the sort of like the next section of my career, which was pretty much 10 to 15 years of a combination of working for universities as a learning technology manager, so looking after their e-learning systems, building online course content. The more interesting aspects of that might be building video case studies, where effectively, if anybody's familiar with the video arts featuring John Cleese and other actors, where they show examples of good and usually bad practice in the workplace and how to avoid the howlers. I was doing that, but creating videos to teach psychiatry, working with the academics with the subject matter expertise, but just preparing these resources to give trainee psychiatrists some exposure and some a safe space, or what they might call it digitally, a sandpit to make mistakes before being allowed to actually talk and carry out diagnosis with actual patients. As part during that period when I was doing e-learning, I also got into business analysis, did some of the standard courses that the trade body, some of you may be aware of, British Computer Society, but operates worldwide, did their certifications in business analysis. At the same time, having worked for a number of universities, including King's College London, I decided in 2013 to have a go at freelancing. So it was effectively doing a similar job, but as a consultant,
Mm.
running my own one band limited company, which was again good experience, experience you don't necessarily get as obviously as an employee working for somebody else directly. So that sort of added to my quote unquote broader education, certainly my business education. And I'd recommend that to anybody who wants to have a challenge and just try something different at some stage in their career. This brings me up more to the present, or say 2017, when I joined the United Kingdom Civil Service as something called a consulting technical architect. Worked for 5 years for the Cabinet Office. And there I was involved in a sort of range of usually identifying digital technologies, but equating that technology with the business needs and the organizational needs. So, if you like, a bit like an internal management consultant. Got to work on some very interesting things, including the EU exit transition programme, and doing a lot of work on modelling trade logistics of things. So actually working with a lot of policy professionals in the Cabinet Office and DEFRA, that's our Department for Environment, and the Home Office and such like. I also did a bit of work as an auditor, assuring government projects, IT, sometimes non-IT, but actually getting to sit to interview some quite high up people and ask them programs about how's your program doing? Are you going, and actually getting to rag rate it, where in summary that's giving a program a red, amber or green. If you give it a red, it really is in trouble. So you don't give them very often for obvious reasons. You have to really justify it, and you're ideally looking to give them a green. Truth, as you'd expect, most of them end up somewhere in that amber zone.
Yeah.
This pretty much takes me more up to date with business architecture. I left my first stint at the civil service at the end of 2022, was offered a job working for a building company, a private sector, who'd never done business architecture before. So it was totally new territory for them. It was new territory for me, because I literally was learning on the job in an environment that had never used it before, which is makes life interesting, should we say. And I wouldn't say it was the most easiest period of my career, but I learned an enormous amount and have liberally borrowed from that experience in the book I've written as an example of like how to apply business architecture in a practical context, or one way of doing it. And so that's something I bring out in the book as one of the themes that more or less takes me up to the present. I currently work for an organisation, another public sector organisation called the UK Health Security Agency, most widely known for establishing all the services such as the respondent service during the recent COVID lockdown and pandemic. There, I work there as a business architect, which really takes me right up to date now. I think that's my semi-potted summary as best as I can do.
It's really amazing because there are so many people that have these kind of journeys that are so different, and then you end up landing in architecture. And I think this is quite important because, I mean, mine was similar, but I think it's important because one of the things with writing your book, which is called Doing Business Architecture and then a Rough Guide, helps people who navigating into this new space and really gives an idea of what you can expect. And of course, you have a sense of humor. You mentioned John Cleese, so I was thinking, oh, maybe you got a couple of tips from him in terms of humor, did you?
I think the best tip he ever gave me is don't get divorced, because he said he'd be a rich man if he hadn't had several divorces. So I thought that's a good tip, and I don't think that features in video arts, but I just named that. But no, he really got. I think video arts predates even e-learning and the web, and a few decades. I think it was set up in the 70s originally, just leveraging the talents of professional actors and applying it in a slightly different context. And it's this thing. I think people learn from seeing things go really wrong, in the same way as one might, if one was into gaming. I wasn't particularly, but if you're into adventure gaming, you could do all sorts of things you wouldn't necessarily do in quote unquote real life.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like watching these video case studies. I did do another one for a management college where we were training students in how to undertake a legal moot, a legal
Mm.
court scenario, so that the technique can be applied to a number of different areas.
Okay, good. It is funny though. That's his tip for life. to get divorced. All right, so let's talk a little bit about business architecture. I know I'm passionate about it. You and I've had quite a few conversations about it. You're also
Absolutely.
passionate about it. Now, so in your view, what do you understand by business architecture? Because there is obviously a lot of differences between enterprise architecture, business analysis, but there are a lot of similarities as well. So what would distinguish business architecture in your mind from these other disciplines? And why would we need business architecture compared to other things? What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I'll start by saying what I think it isn't, which is And this is not that you could find many people, including in teams I work with, who disagree with me vehemently on this. But what I don't believe it is merely a strand under this all encompassing umbrella called enterprise architecture alongside data or applications, cybersecurity, and all that. That is not to say there is not a massive overlap between business architecture and these digital disciplines. Of course, there is, but you could apply business architecture to human resources, you could apply it to law, you could apply it to a lot of things which aren't ostensibly IT sector
Yeah.
businesses. It's not that everything uses IT pretty much, but they're not IT or software or IT development. The UK at the moment, there is still this perception business architecture is this quote unquote techie thing,
Mm.
which I prefer to go to the Business Architecture Guild sort of definition, which is essentially, I think the Winnie Coon came with this, was really good. It's a golden thread linking board level strategy through to delivery. It's that
Nice.
bit, that interface. You have the strategy. Often they're quite high level. Often they're quite generic because they have to apply to so many people in so many different contexts. Business architecture helps to filter that along with other things like a target operating model, a business model, canvas, and information model. It helps you to make practical inroads into achieving an organizational strategy in a way it makes it realistic and it realizes it.
That's a good definition. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'd go with that. And for business analysis, how would you say that would be different? What would be the difference in the two?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of time for business analysis. As I say, I spent a lot of time. I did the business analysis certificate way back in 2013. More recently, in 2020, I did what's called, I think it's called this across the globe, the International Diploma in Business Analysis.
Mm.
And I see business analysis as, I would say it's more project or program or in portfolio specific. So if you've got a specific business challenge which needs to be delivered by a program in some way, it's the sort of interface between the business or organization and the delivery, but focused on specific things like capturing requirements or end-to-end process modeling. So it's focusing, if you like, on I don't know if it's a
The
vertical, it's
doing.
focusing on a project, a
Yeah,
program. It's not
yeah.
holistically something that's looking across the board of an organization in the way that business architecture does. So if you had like a business capability model, you could take each of those capabilities at a top level. And I don't know, in a given organization, there might be about 30, 40, 50 of them. You could decompose them quite a long way before you got, and you'd find whatever level of decomposition eventually you get to start of individual organizational business processes. So I'll give an economist type definition. The business architecture is the macro way of looking at it. The business analyst is the micro way of looking at it. I literally just came up with that. I don't know whether it's a good or bad analogy, but it literally came to me right now as a way to try and, or my
Yeah.
way, how I interpret both disciplines.
Yes, I think I'd agree with that. I often say that business analysts are like investigative journalists. They work in a specific, they're boots on the ground and they work for a specific insight, whereas your architect is really looking to understand the ecosystem of what is happening within the organization. So, yeah, I would say it's something similar. Let's talk about business architecture and maturity. Now, there's a lot of people. So business architecture is actually quite new. If you look at it from, you mentioned BizBark, and obviously I'm a big fan of the BizBark as well. But that only came out in 2015. That's 10 years, which is not very long in terms of architecture, although some of architecture came out initially with your enterprise architecture and so forth, but it just didn't go down to that level of really engaging with the business. It was more of an IT kind of environment. So when we look at your business maturity and you're working in architecture at the moment, how close is the business to really understanding architecture? What do you need to do? How does it work? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I went to the building company, the first thing I had to do was explain business architecture isn't about throwing up office blocks or fit out, which was their core business. So you can imagine that the very word architect got made all sorts of fun in the initial definition. I look at, say, the Business Architecture Guild, and I look at all the stuff. One of the things I did in preparing for my certified business architect exam alongside your excellent course, which I'm not, and I don't praise anything unless I really mean it. It's a really good course for anybody who wants to be a business architect. One of the other things I did was just look through all the reference architectures, all the videos on that Business Architecture Guild site, or a good subsection of them. And even those dating from 2015, it strikes me where we're in 2025 now. If you go to the UK, we're probably not even where they might have been, say, in the States or other early adopters 10 years ago. You could go and look at job adverts in the United Kingdom, and you could still get very different definitions of
Definitions.
business architect. You actually can get very different definitions of a business analyst, even though that I feel that's more matured and a lot more people in business have got an idea what that is, but you still get these, what do they call, sometimes you'll get the business systems analyst,
Yeah.
which is more a euphemism for knowing a very specific project as SAP or something like that very well, and the details how to use it doesn't really equate to business analysis techniques in a more abstract
Mm.
way. The UK is pretty low on the business architecture part. I'd say it varies by sector. I think you tend to find the financial services sector tends to be a bit more clued up on
Mature.
these things.
Mm.
I don't know whether
Yeah.
that's just the nature of it.
I think that's around the world, actually. I think,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. If it's going
If
to
I was,
optimize your bottom line, that's usually a good place to start.
I'll speak very generically rather than specifically, but I was looking at the UK public sector at the moment. There's still a large education piece and debate to be had about what business architecture is. There's actually one even for other things like enterprise architecture, to an extent, business analysis, even. And when I joined the Cabinet Office back in 2017, there was a lot of things called user research. There was a lot of stuff called service design. Anybody who's encountered both those techniques know there's a massive overlap with business analysis. All that's really different is those two former things emerged from like products and marketing and that world, whereas originally business analysis merged from what used to be called, going way back to the 70s, 80s, and such, systems analysis. But they met at a point, but you'll still often find, certainly in the UK public sector, you'll find a lot of people who may describe themselves as service designers, user researchers, performance analysts. And I've had to go at all those things in part in my time in the civil service, but you rarely find business analysts even now per se. That's not so much the case elsewhere. I think it's a very widely used term, certainly private sector, but compare that with business architecture, it's still, I say, it's in its Cinderella phase in the UK, which in some ways that's exciting. That's an opportunity, and it's nice to have something new that isn't called AI or
Yeah.
whatever else it is. That's not the only new kid in town, as it were. So it's good for me. It means I won't evangelize a bit about it. It might be a bit strong, but at least try and explain what it really is and dispel some of the perhaps perception some people have of it, which may not be as close to reality as they
Mm.
might think.
If you were to look at introducing, so obviously a lot of this is in your book, right? So it's not just us talking, but you also mention a lot of these things in your book around the state of where things are. But if you were introducing, so you've mentioned now when you were trying to introduce business architecture to this business, for companies or industries that have never used architecture before or haven't even heard of it, because that can happen as well, what are the essential first steps for them to actually be able to land? And I know you cover this in your book,
Yeah, do you know
but
what one of the things I did, this is how when I took this job at this building company, they said, "Oh, we've got this task. We want you to build a business capability model." I didn't know what that was. Well, how do you find out something if you don't know what it is went onto YouTube. It was, I think he's been on some of these series, Jesper's video on business capability
Yes.
modeling, which was
Yeah.
fantastic because in the space of 15 minutes, it articulated using the concept of a vehicle manufacturer exactly what business capabilities were. And
Hmm.
by looking at it in that example, in that context of motor manufacturing, you could extrapolate what the concept of a capability is to any given sphere of activity. You have you could have capabilities in, and by that just doing activities which tend to be timeless in the business, i.e., a bank has always kept accounts. It's always had customers of some sort. The policies and the technology and the way it does it and change. And that's where your business canvas and your organization models, your technical landscape, your policy framework, and all the rest of it do change. But I certainly look at business capabilities of this thing as if you were to try and describe what it is your business does as a series of verb nouns, that's a nice way of depicting it. And it's like everything. It seems when you look at it, it seems a relatively simple concept, and so many really good concepts. When you look at it, it seems simple. You think, why the hell couldn't I have come up with that? But I mean, that's the case with a lot of good things. It's that their actually originality is actually belies their simplicity when you look at it and you think, oh, that makes common sense. Why isn't everybody doing this?
I know. I had a similar thing. I came from a background that was more around also learning and massive transformations and business analysis. And so I would say I was probably a process queen at that stage. And then got introduced, and this was 2009, 2010, to business architecture and had to unlearn everything about processes to learn capabilities. And it just made sense. It took a while, don't get me wrong, because the unlearning takes a while. But I agree with you. These are the building blocks of our organization. These are the things that we need to know. So when you were working in this company and you were discovering capabilities, how would you do it if, let's say, the company didn't know anything about capabilities? Because there are a lot of people that say things like, oh, these are just weird blocks.
Yeah,
What is,
no,
how are we doing this?
absolutely. I had an extra challenge in that I wasn't actually allowed to go and interview anybody in that company, which,
Oh, wow.
if you're a
Okay.
business architect, that really probably explains why I was only there for 6 months. But that's history, and the company doesn't actually exist anymore. But that's for all sorts of reasons, non directly attributable to me, at least I hope. But you saw usually a company will have an organogram of some sort. Usually it will have a either a glossy brochure, or the website will have something about its strategy. And if you're really lucky, it will have something from which you can then divide one or two value chains or value streams, which for those not familiar, I'm not going to define this very well, but essentially, if you imagine you're an external customer and you are engaging with an organization, you think of the whole organization as a black box, whose
Mm.
output is something of value to you. Within that black box, there's a series of steps which add incremental value to the end to an endpoint, which is that whole total what a value proposition for anybody who's again familiar with the business model canvas and the value model canvas. The value stream, I think it's something, is it 4 or 5? You have 4 or 5 of them in a given organization as a rule of
Yeah.
thumb. So they're really high level things encompassing many end to end processes and cut and touch points and all the rest of it. But usually for that top level, you can get a bit of an insight into what the journey is. So for the building company, I was looking at, I think they did 3 things, one of which was interior office fit out. Well, there's a series of things from commissioning the building through to discussing the design, through to tendering, through to building it, through to delivering it and signing off. So you can see
Yeah.
there's a set of very generic high level steps, but form your value chain under which a whole lot of these aforementioned business capabilities can sit. If you have
Mm.
that information together, you can start to do some sort of things. You can start to look at metrics and Everything is increasingly about analytics and metrics and return on investment. And I actually feel that's a good thing in a way, because often
I agree.
things were measured very qualitatively and not with any very clear outcome. Not everything it
Yeah.
can be quantitative, but I certainly have always felt in business outside the realms of management in financial accountancy that some of the other metrics were at best vague and tenuous. I was at e-learning for a long time, and you tended to have the sort of outcomes like it was a great student experience. Our students really loved it. And don't get me wrong, that's really important. But it would be very
What do you
difficult to
do?
get a vice chancellor or anybody in the finance side of it to sign off on
Mm.
those are your metrics. Where's your return on investment? And that's even that word is probably unknown amongst most, or it certainly was amongst most learning technology professionals I worked with at the time. That's not their fault. It's just culturally
Yeah.
that quantitative look at things was just outside of that sort of lexicon, that sort of area of activity. In the same way I was
Mm.
talking earlier about this, some of these terms like business architect are still to seep into other areas, including, frankly, the digital space.
Yeah, which actually is the next question I'm going to ask you. There's a lot of upskilling needed, right? And you've spoken a little bit about your training background and looking at your e-learning platforms and so forth. What do people need to know? And let's assume we've got AI, of course, we've got architecture, which I think is going to become even more important as AI becomes more discerning of itself. We're going to have to architect the business a lot better. So what are your thoughts around the future? What are your thoughts around architecture and so forth?
Yeah,
Upskilling, sorry. So
upskilling certainly, and this is one of
yeah,
the themes I was,
yes.
apart from talking about business architecture in this book, I'm trying to make it a bit more generic in the sense of how do you learn to make a slight career shift to anything within, it doesn't even have to be a digital space, but just let's say digital. Let's say I've written a lot of things, which probably is to some extent a statement of the obvious. You go on YouTube, you see a few different experts as a starter, then like I did with Jesper and his business capability video. Then for business architecture, I went and looked at some books. Obviously, those in the business architect will know the business architecture quick guide. It's less than 100 pages, nice and succinct. It doesn't tell you everything, but it tells you enough to get an idea. I
Mm,
read Bill Ulrich's book on business architecture. It's a bit more a broader context and some historical background to how it developed. Also, and this is where certainly this thought of decoupling the enterprise architecture from business architecture, it's certainly from reading his writing on it that sort of resonated with me because I could see it myself. I'd worked in IT teams which were driven by IT for its own sake,
mm,
not necessarily the business. And I have a point I make later in the book about CIOs and CTOs and how they get to quite a high level in their career through being good at technology. And a lot of them are obviously involved in directing migrations from the premise to the cloud and maybe cybersecurity. They get really good at that. I'm not sure how many of them ever broaden themselves and then maybe end up wondering why am I ever going to go onto a board? Because you're a specialist, you're a technical specialist, and you can't be, if you want to be
true.
credible on any sort of board, you've got to know
Yeah.
something about finance, you've got to know something about law and corporate you've got to know such a lot of other things which I just don't, I think you can be sealed off from and still get quite
Mm,
a long way up in a digital career. And that goes for private or public sector, to be honest. I think
mm,
it's the same thing.
mm,
You can get, if you're really driven and the rest of it, you can probably get quite high up to quite a senior digital role, but you won't get any further unless you actually do take that step back and realize you've got to start becoming a bit more, I don't know whether it's a renaissance or a polymath a bit. And I don't think enough of that sector probably do it because I think what really gets them their kicks ultimately is the technology. I would not describe myself as that. I'm pretty ambivalent to, I think, to technology for its own sake. Some things I like, some things I find interesting, but I can just as easily quite easily switch off from it. And I actually feel, in a funny sort of way, having a slightly more skeptical attitude to when people are waxing lyrical about how great Gen AI is going to be. I've just come off a meeting where they're trying to recruit into that area, and again, I'm hearing very young, bright young things waxing lyrical about how brilliant Gen AI is going to be, and out of character, I declined from putting something about, yeah, what if it all goes bloody wrong, sort of thing. But there is that element to it, and I think that
True.
ability sometimes to do the sort of Edward de Bono black hat about these things
Hmm.
is quite a healthy approach to take. At least it saves you getting burned by spending so much money on failed IT projects, which historically has happened.
Yeah. It's really interesting because you mentioned Jesper before. He's got a very interesting view on AI and it's around the capabilities. So, see how much of AI can actually be automated, the capabilities. And I completely agree with the view. So, rather than clipping in a whole bunch of AI componentry into it, let's say the cart, rethink the whole thing completely from an architecture point of view. So yeah, I think some skepticism is needed, and you definitely need to have those that understand how the business works, because if you don't understand how the business is constructed, it's going to be so hard to pull that together.
I think all these things always need a human element, if nothing else, just to act as the
Yeah.
umpire and the referee. I will say, you look at ChatGPT now; it's giving some very eloquent and very. I'll do stupid things. I'll ask it about compare this rugby player to this rugby player, and I did that a few years ago when it first came in. About late 22 when it was, and it would get players right. It really would make real howlers. Now the data sets have increased, the number of parameters have increased with large language models. It's getting really good, convincing, and cogent answers. Nobody's kidded that it's thinking for itself. It's just bringing in lots more information that's out there together, making more sense of it.
True.
I think we've
True.
mentioned this before. It's like, how do you whether it should do this is another a total different debate. But if you wanted to actually make it to think a bit laterally and come up with the unexpected, not just relying on its training data, then I would suggest you have to start deliberately introducing unrelated concepts into that training model
Yeah.
to digest, so it digests that with its existing user to actually, just like anybody creative comes up with. I think if you look again, Debono's talked a lot about this. You take an unrelated thing, add it to an existing thing, and suddenly from that things to unrelated ideas, sometimes you come up with something completely new. And I think to get Jenna, if the idea is to make it truly creative and surprise us with things that we ain't seen before, that is probably the way. I don't know, but I'm sure people are looking at it from those who are in the vanguard trying to bring the next iteration of
Yeah.
DeepMind or whatever it is. Whether we should be doing that is a moot point. That's a whole different ethical debate and all the rest of it.
I know, because there's lots of challenges there. It's not going to go away. It's
No,
just
not at
about,
all. It's
yeah. You actually talk in the book about challenging the status quo and conventional wisdom. And so I think some of this leads to that conversation. Maybe if you could share an example of what you looking at, how would you rethink something? What are the challenges that occur? Or are you referring directly to something in particular?
I think you realize you have to start challenging it. This is the thing I'm not particularly good at. Sometimes there's environments where challenging the status quo gets you in loads of hot water.
Yeah.
I will, again, without being specific, the UK public sector, every public sector is a case in point. You don't necessarily get on there by being original or innovative or coming up with new things, because the systems are designed
Yeah.
to activate. They're designed for continuity. And if you really want to get to the top in that sort of role, I would suggest you get very used to being conforming and be comfortable in that outlook,
Mm.
because
Mm.
but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as entrepreneurial. I'd describe it as functionary. It's a sort of school prefect approach, and that in some more hierarchical and organization or type organizations, that still is the way to get to the top, which is why you sometimes have quite a clash when you've got, say, the political class and the civil service, and the political class want to deliver things because that's what that's their job, depends on a short time frame delivering things, whereas that sometimes there's that tension with the public sector, whose job, I'm not saying this is formal, is continuity
Mm.
and such. I think there was a critique from a long time ago. I don't know if it was Margaret Thatcher or somebody else who used to say it's like the Treasury. They're all about managed decline. This is going back a number of decades, but I sometimes wonder whether that could not still be repeated even now. And I'll say no more on that because I feel the hot water already coming upon me.
Well, I think that, yeah, just the topic would bring some hot water. What guidance would you give IT professionals transitioning roles, aiming to pivot, let's say, maybe into architecture, almost more strategic roles? What is the mindset that they need to be aware of? What are the things that what are some tips that you would
Yeah.
want to give them if they are going into that space?
Yeah, I'm far from the best example, to be honest. But I would first get in the mindset of not thinking of themselves as IT professionals. And that's not to decry that, but I think by labeling yourself as that, you are, whether you like it or not, there's others outside that sphere who will look at you as there's the techie team, that's what they like, that's what they do. Let's give them some techie to play with, they'll be happy, we'll make all the important decisions and lead, and they can do the heavy lifting for us. So you've got to be aware, one's got to be aware that anybody who is not quote unquote in that digital framework have maybe more implicitly, they will never admit to that explicitly, but I think there is a pecking order. And if you come at this thing about the CIO or CTO, if your brand is based exclusively on your technological competence, and I'm not talking about startups and the Elon Musk and stuff, because obviously that's a
Mhm.
whole sector. That it means that has a far more of a kudos when you're on a digital industry. But more generally,
Mm.
in a sector, I would just say think of yourselves as being capable of learning a lot of different things and as being a generalist rather than just a technical specialist. And I say at some point, wherever it is, I think it comes quite early on, your mid-20s or even sooner, start reading stuff that's outside of, especially if you are into of just the technical guide, all the technical things. Get a book on English law, get a book on accounting, just immerse, or these days look at YouTube even to start with. Just look at something that's outside of what you've done already, because this is a more general point. You are your own career manager. There's no career paths anymore in any way, shape, or form, with the exception of the armed services and certain other things. Organize the social contract between employers and employees has changed so much. It's all over the business press, has been for some time. Businesses ultimately are there to get activities done. They're not there to make anybody have a fulfilling career as an end game. That's not what they get judged on. That really is
Mm.
down to everybody. It's quite a difficult thing because effectively you have to be quote unquote entrepreneurial. It's not necessarily what school or university or anything trains you to be. There you are given a quite a almost comforting structure of targets to achieve that are set by and ways in which they can be independently assessed.
Mm.
Then you go into the big wide world of work and you suddenly find you've got these things called performance appraisals, which for most of us are worth Jack Jones. They really are not worth the paper they're written on, simply because there's still a bit of a disconnect between, is this basically just a chance to check that I'm doing my job competently and I may need upskilling? And if that's all it was, I actually think it would be far more healthy. It's when they try and introduce career elements to it, which are so
Yeah.
superficial as to appear almost trite. There's still a few conversations to be had about what work can afford people in terms of their overall life and what it can't afford anymore. And it certainly isn't an organisation's role to give anybody an enjoying and enthusiastic or varied career, because that is not what they're judged on, despite what they will put on the graduate training scheme or whatever else. So to speak,
Yeah.
there's a bit of smoke and mirrors there. That's my cynicism coming out, but I don't think that's a unique opinion. If it was independently
There's
canvassed.
very interesting concepts that you've raised there. Like, number one, if you look at it from a generational point of view, your boomers, they had jobs for life, right? So your goal is to just go up the food chain, right? But that has changed completely. Absolutely, there's no guarantees, there's no means of you're going to have a job for life. That's not going to occur. But then on the other side, if you look at the younger generation, they probably think that the owner or the business is there to make them happy and feel good and all of those kind of things, and then they can just leave when they want to. So there's this weird dichotomy, as you said, going on in the workplace. At the end of the day, what's the best option for the individual? It would be to upskill yourself, as you said, and really keep yourself entertained and educated and try new things,
Yeah,
you know.
it could be as simple as somebody in some sphere of activity who you admire. It might be like looking at the summit of Mount Everest from the foothills, but read a biography or something if you have time, or just even just do a short summary online. Find out how they got to where they are. As you'll say, you'll find it's amazing how much serendipity there is, how many quirks, how many. If it had gone this way, they might have done this rather than that. What's it's almost frightening is there's so much of it is out of people's control, events and changes and things, but the one bit you can control is that sort of that vision of what do I see, what would I like to do now. That god awful question they sometimes ask, where do you see yourselves in 5 years time? The very pits of hell open up below you and you say, I've no idea. That's what you're saying internally, but you have to go and structure some sort of coherent roadmap of what you'd like to do. And usually, when you're doing it, it sounds so dully dull and tedious because you're doing it in the context of wanting to secure this particular job at this particular time, which you're probably going to leave in a few years anyway to go on to the next best thing. But in reality, it's just having an endpoint and breaking it down and visualizing yourself doing not maybe the top of the thing, but even having that at the back of your mind is probably no bad thing, because I'm sure I've read somewhere that subconsciously everything you do, even if you might not use art, every decision you make is moving you in that way.
Yeah, yeah, I would
But
say. I
but
think
as
that
I
that's
say, the
yeah,
responsibility is on all of us to manage our own career. I will say this for my uni, but even they did start talking about this even way back in the 90s. They were saying it's going to be different. I've seen the example of my own parent. My parents were just about pre-boomers, whatever, born during the Second World War. So I'd seen that career for life thing. And I'd also seen the fact that it's not so long. You go back to the end of the 80s. Once you were past 48, you were dead in the water. I remember my dad, my late father, looking at a whole load of CVs, looking at them, and literally, whereas people complain now, and perhaps fairly, about AI doing the papers to them, it was done purely on it. This is before age legislation. It was like anybody over 48 off to the golf club or whatever, because that was the end of your
yeah,
aspirational work. I would say it's more positive now in that there's less, you can't overtly discriminate in the same way, but let's face it, it's a human nature to pick people we like. And if you
mm,
want to be in a young tech startup, probably being a young tech type person is probably going to get you more chance of being in there or to
yeah.
be equal than being somebody like me in there. Not that I aspire to do that now, thank god I'm past that age.
So let's talk a little bit around the future. So what do you see looking ahead? And then let's get into the details of the book. So the future role of business architecture, how do you see this role shaping not just technology decisions, but broader business strategy and innovation? So what are your thoughts around that?
What I'd like to see And this is the role of business architect being a sort of pathway for those who started, like myself, in a sort of digital. I mean, I started in IT accidentally. It wasn't like I'd woken up like a kid and say, I want to be a spaceman one day, or I want to be an IT. I certainly didn't. I remember reading an IT Press article. It was for IBM or something. Other brands may be available where they had all these kids saying, I want to be a ballerina, or I want to be a spaceman. And then they say, now is working as a cloud software. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that is so depressing. It really, the actual thing I was getting from the ad was probably the exact opposite of the thing they were trying to infuse, but it just landed very maybe. But what I'm going back to is, I think business architecture is potential, and the jury's out on this, but it's potentially one of the few pathways to route if you want to go from being purely in a technical remit to more towards a more generic board level business thing. And maybe that route is from business architecture through to more business strategy. Hence, you get this once you're into the realms of strategy and all the rest of it. And if you had learned enough about the other things, the finance, the law, and all the rest of it, you make your own value proposition more compelling as somebody who may have add value as an actual business person rather than just an IT professional. So I'd say my vision for business architecture, it's not so much technically what it's as a possible route for those who aspire to do it. Not everybody does, but those who aspire to move out of purely a digital centric thing to more board level type operation, but your knowledge of or exposure to technologies would be valuable to the board. But as I say, you have to package it in a way that it doesn't just scream I'm IT, and because you will be treated as the backroom boffin, that because that will be the perception. Everybody who's been on the MBAs and all the rest of it, you have that glass ceiling to break, as it were.
That's a good point. And I did like the IT guys. I don't know if you ever saw that series. I think it was a British series where they've
I
got,
know which one. I don't. I think I saw an episode of it, and it's what. But
it's
the
hilarious.
IT crowd. I do.
Yeah, the
I think
IT
I
guys.
think when it was aired, it was so close to home that I didn't dare watch it. Actually, it was.
It was really funny, especially that guy in the basement. That is, I don't know, he does the technical stuff. And then the manager who knows nothing about IT, which is really hilarious. But yeah, it reminded me a little bit about that. Then going back to your book, how can people find it? Where is it? How would you summarize it for somebody who's interested in looking at it?
Yeah, I think I put it on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, pretty much all the Amazons. If you, what I would, they interestingly, they've actually put it with it, or maybe that is me when I tried to do the settings. They put it with more the sort of business satire type guides. You won't
Okay.
necessarily find it with the technical business architecture books. And to be fair, as I mentioned a few, like Bill Ulrichs and Winard Kuhn's book Strategy to Reality, I'm not trying to do what they've already done. They do it very well. I would recommend anybody who wants to know the nuts and bolts of the details to go and look at those books. Mine is more a sort of how one might land it practically. I've included a few mathematical things which certainly you won't find in the Babok, and some stuff on simulation and modeling, which are it's arguable whether it's business analysis, performance analysis, or whatever you call it. It's not necessarily strictly pure business architecture. I've put some extra bits in like that just where I found it actually to be quite handy. Even mathematical modeling,
Really?
which puts loads of people off, by the
Yeah.
way, but there is a bit on there for those who can have a towel and a cup of coffee to wade through.
What I like is that you've taken some of the resources from various different places and you've brought it together. And I think that's really nice because, yes, there are resources available online, but sometimes that practical, okay, but the theory is great, but how do I actually get this done? And what are the options for me to consider? So, who would you say should read your book? Who's your likely audience?
I'd like to say anybody who's involved in some way of having to execute organizational strategy, ultimately coming off some form of board of directors or executive committee, as they're sometimes called in the public sector. Anybody who's charged with having to, any manager or any specialist who's charged with having to deliver something and actually measure the results of that delivery against the targets set by the strategy. I think that's where business architecture can really help. So I like to think it's pretty much applicable to describing that, because I think business architecture is pretty broad. And one of the things I'm supposed reiterating is business architecture is about a lot more than the digital space, the IT department, and all the rest of it. It really is holistically applied. It can apply and add value to any part of an organization.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations on your work and your efforts.
Thank you.
Had some great conversations as well, and you contribute to the community as well with asking good questions. I think that's been fantastic. And despite, I suppose, you asking hard questions around AI, you're actually quite a big advocate of it too. So that is a nice balance to have somebody who can look at it from a critical point of view, but also be objective in terms of where we should be going and what we should be doing. So it's been wonderful chatting to you today,
Likewise.
Julia. And I will add the links to how you can access the book. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. Just put
Yeah.
Julian Fletcher, Julian. There's not so many Julian Fletchers out there, I don't think. Not on LinkedIn anyway. So
Yeah,
you'll find me on LinkedIn. Anybody who wants to, know more and discuss further, please do.
that's great. So we'll add your profile as well to the blog that we are sending out. But wonderful to have had you today. Thank you, Julian, for your time. Really
You're very
appreciate it.
welcome.
And we'll end the session now.
Thanks.